Well, we want to welcome everyone who has joined us today. This is the first webinar put on by the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign. So we're very excited, and this is just the first in a series of webinars. We already have one that we're organizing on the 30th of April. That's going to be at 9:30 in the morning with representatives from Human Rights Watch to update us on the situation in Yemen. The Raytheon Anti-War Campaign, its main goal has always been to raise awareness about the war in Yemen, now over 5 years old, and one of the worst humanitarian situations in the world today. So the theory of the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign has always been raise awareness around Yemen by using Raytheon and its role in that war, being that Raytheon is headquartered right here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So as my colleague Paul says so often and so well, Yemen may seem like it's on the other side of the world, but when you consider the role that Massachusetts plays in that war, it's right here. It's right here, and that is something that we like to remind people of every time we do this. We have a wonderful program for you today. As you can see, we have Professor Shireen al-Adeimi, who is a professor of education at Michigan State University. She was born in Yemen and actually lived through 2 civil wars in her home country. So we have a very knowledgeable guest for you today. Since the war broke out in 2015, she has been an activist to raise awareness about what's going on in Yemen and to stop that war and to stop U.S. involvement in that war. And I want to say congratulations because we have just heard from Professor al-Adeimi that this past February she just became an American citizen. So we want to congratulate her on that, and we are very pleased to bring her knowledge of what's going on in Yemen to everyone who has joined us. So this is a production of the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign. We hope that everyone will get involved with this campaign to raise awareness and fight back against the military-industrial complex in our own backyard. If you're part of an organization, we would like you to join our growing coalition. So far we are Massachusetts Peace Action, United Against War and Militarism, Veterans for Peace, the Smedley Butler Brigade, the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, American Friends Service Committee, Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, and the Friends Meeting at Cambridge. But we are a growing coalition, and if you're part of an organization that I didn't name, we would love for you to join us. So this is an important effort, and we need your support and your activism to make a change. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Professor al-Adeimi for a wonderful presentation about Yemen. Very much looking forward to it, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it too.
Thank you so much, Brian, and everyone for coming, and Massachusetts Peace Action Committee for hosting. I'm really happy to be here and to share what I know about the origins of the war in Yemen. I'm going to start sharing my screen. 1 second. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So I will talk to you about the origins of the war. Trying to.
You froze up, Shireen.
Yep.
We can still hear you though.
You can hear me, but I'm completely frozen and I can't. This was just working a minute ago, isn't it?
It was. We tested it just minutes ago. Gotta love that technology, don't you?
Maybe if you can, if there's anything you want to share with the attendees while I restart, I think I'm going to have to restart.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll give Shireen a little time to reconfigure her machine there. And once again, we would like to reiterate that this is only the first in a series of webinars that we are going to be sharing. I see someone has learned how to use the question and answer. Someone asks, how many attendees are here? Right now we have 45 participants that are joining us, and I can see, oh, all right, so Cole and Paul have stopped sharing their screens, and hopefully that allows a bit more bandwidth for Shireen. But as I said, this is just the first in a series of webinars. Paul has organized one for April 30th. That's going to be at 9:30 a.m. But don't worry if you don't like to get up that early. We do make a video copy of all of our webinars, and they are shared on the Mass Peace Action YouTube page. And we will be following up this webinar and all of our webinars with emails that will include action steps that you can take, ways that you can get involved, as well as links to the video and audio of our webinars, so you can share them with your friends that maybe couldn't make it live, or watch it again if you're so moved. I would also like to share that we are just now organizing, it looks like it's going to be in the first week of May, a webinar that will feature Major Danny Sherzin, who is a wonderful new peace activist, peace and anti-war activist, who comes from a military background. He served both in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as teaching history at West Point, also a West Point graduate. So very much in the club, and has now, after what he has seen and experienced, become an anti-war activist. So that's a very exciting webinar as well. We are also launching a change.org position to try and encourage, in this time, Raytheon to use its manufacturing capabilities to make ventilators instead of bombs. We feel that we should ask them to do something useful in this time, because just like us, family and neighbors of the folks that work at Raytheon are worried about COVID-19 as well. So we will be sharing a change.org link with you, and we invite you to sign on. It looks like Shireen's machine is back up and running. So let's try this again, take two. Take it away, Shireen.
Thank you so much. And apologies for that. I'm not sure what happened, but in the talk today, I would like to go over what's happening right now in Yemen. But before we do that, of course, we need to go through a country overview. I'll talk you through some key events from 1990 to 2015, which I think will help set the stage for why what's happening today is happening. And then I'll go through the foreign intervention, who's involved, what it entails, and the outcome of that foreign intervention in terms of the humanitarian toll. I'm also going to end with current update on aid in Yemen, as well as coronavirus and ceasefire, and then we'll end with a discussion where I'll be taking questions from those of you who've attended. So this is where Yemen is, in the southernmost tip of the Arabian Peninsula in West Asia. And some overview, the population is almost 30 million people, so it's a fairly densely populated country. It's the same population as Saudi Arabia, which is much larger. The capital is Sana'a in northern Yemen, and the official language is Arabic. Some economic indicators. It's important to note that even before the war began, so in 2015, over half of the population lived under $2 per day. And when we think about the impact on this war has had on Yemen, it's important to know why, and it's because it was the Middle East's poorest country to begin with. The government type is a constitutional republic, and I do that to distinguish it from other countries in the region. So you have Oman over here, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, of course, and none of these countries are democracies or republics. They're all monarchies, sultanates, and emirates. So Yemen has had a long spirit of revolution, and it's a very different government structure than its neighboring countries. Historical regions are North and South Yemen. You often hear that still. So this area here in orange is considered Northern Yemen, and the area in green is Southern Yemen. So North Yemen used to be ruled from the 1500s up until 1918 by the Ottoman Empire, which collapsed at the end of World War I, after which Yemen was ruled by North Yemenis, the Mutawakkilite Kingdom of Yemen, until 1962, when they were deposed in a revolutionary war. And then it became the Yemen Arab Republic from 1962 until 1990, with its capital, Sana'a. South Yemen had a very different history and trajectory. So South Yemen was ruled by the British from 1839 to 1967, so for a very long time, and after which it became the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. This was the Middle East's first and only Marxist country, and that lasted until 1990 with its capital, Aden. And actually I was born right here in Aden, so I was born when the country was a Marxist country, and then it became United Yemen in 1990. So that was the key change then. In 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the southern leaders of Yemen, who again were Marxist country, began negotiating with the North to try to bring the two countries together. That was always the hope and dream, that the countries would be reunited. But the collapse of the Soviet Union became the impetus for this unification. And it became the Republic of Yemen under President Saleh, who was the president of North Yemen from 1978. And the southern leader of the Socialist Party became Yemen's vice president. And that's President Saleh. Unfortunately, this unity didn't last very long. And by 1994, the South declared secession from the North. This was a summer war, what turned out to be a summer war. Saleh responded with force and kind of brought the country back together under this realm of unity. And there are many reasons why the South felt like they wanted to secede from the North. And those grievances have continued to play out. About a decade later, in 2004 to 2010, they were the Saleh Houthi wars. And so who are the Houthis? They call themselves Ansarullah, and I'm sure that any article that you read about Yemen, you'll find reference to the Houthis. The Houthi name is a family name, and they're a family from northern Yemen in the province of Sada, which, as you can see, borders Saudi Arabia. And they practice Zaidi Islam like about 40% of Yemenis, including former President Saleh. And I mention this because often this gets portrayed as a Sunni Shia war, and it's anything but a sectarian war. Their main grievances were Saleh's corruption. So he was the de facto ruler from 1978, and then became the ruler of a united Yemen in 1990. And it was no secret that the man was corrupt, and the country kept plunging into poverty while he enriched himself. And there was a lot of foreign intervention. And so the Houthis were among the many people in Yemen who were preaching against Saleh's corruption, but they were doing it more outwardly so. And so he responded with launching 6 various wars. He tried to recruit the Americans unsuccessfully, but successfully recruited the Saudis in those wars. And although they killed their leader, Hussein al-Houthi, the movement continued to grow stronger. So then to summarize up until this point, by 2010, Yemen had only been united as a country for 20 years. It was impacted by a long history of colonialism and colonial rule. It was ruled undemocratically by a class of elites, at the head of whom was Saleh. And he faced various political threats, Houthis in the north and secessionists in the south. And there was a growing discontent among average Yemenis after years and political challenges. And so by early 2011 then, as you may remember, North African Arabs revolted against their rulers. This picture is from Egypt and the protests that happened in Egypt in January of 2011. It started in Tunisia, followed by Egypt, and then Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, and other countries, of course, followed. And so this was the start of the Arab Spring. And the timeline of the revolution, I think, is also important. It started off as peaceful protests with many different factions joining the protests, including the Houthis. And initially what started off as the peaceful people's protest kind of was co-opted, I would argue, by the Islah Party, who were co-rulers with Saleh. They're the Muslim Brotherhood faction of Yemen, although it's a very different kind of brotherhood party that we see in Yemen. And they tried to use force to get Saleh to resign, and he refused. There was armed clashes that resulted in an assassination attempt, and he survived with severe burns. He was treated in Saudi Arabia. But by November of that year, Saleh finally transferred power to his vice president, Hadi, in an agreed upon 2-year term. So then Hadi is another key character that I'm going to go over. He is Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi. He's currently the UN recognized president of Yemen. He began his military career in South Yemen. He's from the south, and before moving to the north. After which he served as Saleh's defense minister. What's important here is that it was important, I guess, for Saleh to have a southern Yemeni kind of lead the fight against South Yemenis in their quest for independence. And so he led that 1994 war. And many say that as a reward was promoted in that same year to his being his vice president. So he was a close Saleh ally and his VP from 1994 up until 2011, when Saleh transferred power to him. So it was supposed to be a 2-year term, and 3 years later, Houthis ended up taking over Sana'a. Now, it's interesting here, and I apologize, some of you may be interested in this, for others this may be getting into the weeds of it. But Saleh, unlike other Arab Spring presidents, got to stay in Yemen and maintain his power. In fact, was still in command of large factions of the Yemeni army. And what was interesting was that in late 2014, when the Houthis essentially staged a coup and took over the capital, the military didn't resist their presence. And so there were a lot of questions about, well, whether is Saleh working with the Houthis now? Is this his second coming? It makes no sense that he would work with them given all the wars that they waged against each other. But it turned out that that was in fact the case, that they did in fact unite together. In those early months, though, there was still some hope that things were going to turn around, and the Houthis and the government signed a UN-sponsored deal to form a UN government. That all fell apart by January and February of 2015, when Hadi was placed under house arrest by the Houthis, and he resigned and fled to Aden in the south, withdrew his resignation, and the Houthis followed Hadi to Aden. So this was the start of the civil war. So a lot of times people will say, well, the war didn't really begin in 2015. March of 2015, it began in 2014, and this is what they're referring to, the civil unrest that followed the Houthi takeover of Sana'a. What changed was that in March of 2015, the Saudis led their intervention. And this was led by Mohammed bin Salman, or as he is known in the press as MBS. So who is MBS? His father, King Salman, took power in January 2015 when the late king passed away, and he was named defense minister and deputy crown prince at the time. Now, he was relatively unknown and relatively young, and many see this launch of this war just 2 months after he took office as a resume war, you know, kind of to assert himself and who he is. He called it decisive storm and claimed that it would last 2 weeks, and claimed that he is trying to restore the legitimate president of Yemen to the Yemeni people, meaning Hadi. And a couple months later, or actually just a month later, renamed it to Operation Restoring Hope. Apparently we're still in Operation Restoring Hope. And he is currently the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia and its current crown prince. So His goal was to reinstate Hadi, who is currently based out of Saudi Arabia, at least the stated goal. The real aim, of course, is that Yemen has an important strategic location, and it is located right here. It controls Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where 4.8 million barrels of oil, largely Saudi oil, of course, travel per day. And so it's always been in Saudi's interest to maintain control over Yemen and to have somebody in Yemen's government who represents their interests. They've always had that with Saleh. They were certain to have that with Hadi. Houthis became a problem for them because they kind of gained prominence in Yemen for being anti-Saudi and anti-intervention. So there's no way that they were going to be loyal to Saudis. And so they used this, restoring Hadi to power as a way of showing that they just want to restore somebody who will be loyal to them and serve their interests in Yemen. So they assembled this coalition. The Saudi-led coalition is composed of Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Qatar was kicked out of the coalition in 2017 when they had their spat with Saudi Arabia. Bahrain, Kuwait, Morocco left the coalition in February of 2019. Egypt, Sudan, and Senegal remain in the coalition. They also hire mercenaries. So the ex-Blackwater owner, Eric Prince, is based in the UAE, and he operates what's now called Adeimi, and he hires mercenaries from various countries, including Colombia, El Salvador, Australia, South Africa, Panama, Chile, mostly Yemenis though, and even some cases of retired US Army forces who are working for Adeimi in Yemen. Coalition partners include the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and then Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia provide their airspaces and their bases for the coalition. And the Yemeni government consists of essentially Hadi and his allies and the Sah Party and their allies, so everybody who was anti-Saleh and anti-Houthis. And the rebels consisted of former President Saleh and his allies, as well as the Houthis, until 2017, when the inevitable happened and the relationship between Saleh and the Houthis broke down. The Houthis killed Saleh, and they are currently the only rebels against the coalition. Now, it's important to note that the Saleh group and the Houthis formed the Yemeni government in Sana'a, and so that's the current government that is kind of running affairs in the country in northern Yemen, whereas the Yemeni government, Hadi and his allies, are largely based in Saudi Arabia. Of course, you've also heard about Iran's role in the conflict. If you've done any reading, even if you just quickly Google Yemen war, you'll see terms like proxy war, Iran-backed Houthis, and Iran-allied Houthis. I'm going to make a few points, and you can draw the conclusions that you want to draw. In 5 years of war, there have been no Iranians captured or killed in Yemen. There have been no Iranian weapons found in Yemen. The country is under land, air, and naval blockade that's imposed by the Saudi-led coalition with support from the US Navy. And in fact, only 20% of food and aid is allowed to enter the country. And Yemen, which used to import 90% of its food, is not allowed to import anything anymore. And so they control everything that's coming in and out of the country. Journalists have had to smuggle themselves into the country or hide their identities in order to report from within. Aid organizations are often begging the Saudis to let their shipments in. And so to think that Iranians are somehow able to smuggle their weapons in would be a stretch. There's been scant evidence of Iranian involvement in Yemen versus the irrefutable evidence of this multi-nation coalition that's backing Saudi Arabia. So when you hear Iran-backed, it's really not the same as US or Saudi-backed. Those are two very different things that we're talking about. Like I mentioned earlier, Saudi's involvement has a lot more to do with maintaining control over Yemen than their goal of ending Iranian influence. If you'd like to read more, there's an article called Iran's Small Hand in Yemen, and you're free to check that out. But no matter what you read, I invite you to look for the evidence that people are citing, and oftentimes there's very little evidence of significant Iranian involvement beyond, of course, this support that they receive in the media, and maybe their providing some kind of training to the Houthis, but it's very minimal compared to what the Saudis are getting from the US and all their allies that I mentioned earlier. Specific US military involvement, which began under President Obama and continues under President Trump, involves training Saudi soldiers, advising their military personnel, providing their targeting assistance. So when the Saudis are in the command room, they have a US general supporting them with targeting assistance. They maintain, repair, and upgrade vehicles and aircraft, whether those vehicles were purchased from the United States or not. So for example, they also help with the maintaining and repairing of Canadian vehicles that have been purchased by the Saudis. There are 123 contracts of the Saudis that total $120 million per month. And this was from a report that I read from the army.mil article that I'm citing over here a couple of years ago. So this may have changed a little bit. And there was also revelations of US Special Forces or the Green Berets at the Saudi-Yemen border, which of course implies direct combat. Until November of 2018, the Saudis were also getting their jets refueled mid-air by the Americans. And so this, of course, allowed them to stay in the air for much longer. And while that's not happening anymore, supposedly, the US still continues to train UAE and Saudi pilots in Yemen. Under Obama, there were $115 billion in arms sales sold to the Saudis alone. And under Trump, he likes to boast about this 110 billion, which is not as easy to confirm, but it's somewhere in the hundreds of billions, tens of billions that have been sold just to Saudi Arabia. This doesn't even include the UAE and other countries that are in the coalition. The results have been devastating, absolutely devastating to the human civilian population in Yemen. 14 million people, or half the population, is currently facing famine. And the UN has called this, for a couple of years now, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The bombing have been most covered in the news. So this is a picture of UNICEF backpacks that these children were carrying when their school bus was bombed in August of 2018, and 44 little boys were killed. This ended up being a Lockheed Martin bomb that was dropped on these Yemeni children by the Saudis. Other humanitarian impacts, it's hard to put into words what this looks like for people living there, of course. I don't think any of us can imagine what parents and families have to deal with. The numbers on their own are horrific. 80% of the population is in need of humanitarian aid to survive. There have been over 3 million people who are displaced internally. Now, it's difficult for people to leave the country because of the blockade, and so most of them end up being trapped within the country. 19 million people lack access to water. 16.4 million people lack access to healthcare. Yemen has undergone the worst cholera outbreak in history with over 2 million people infected. There have been 100,000 people or more killed. These are statistics by a group called ACLID. And a child under age of 5 dies every 10 minutes in Yemen. And if you add those numbers up, it's terrifying to know the real toll. The only number I've read is 85,000 children starved to death in just 1 year of the war. I really don't know what the full number is, but the blockade is certainly killing a lot more people than those bombs, even though the bombs have caused a lot of devastation. There have been efforts to end the war here in this country. So the War Powers Act of 1973 was introduced after news of Nixon's secret bombing of Cambodia was leaked to the press. And it's a federal law that essentially authorizes Congress and not the president to declare war. Even though every president since Nixon has violated this federal law in order to seek their international endeavors, Congress passed its first war powers bill in 2019, just last year, under the leadership of Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Ro Khanna in the House. Of course, this was a momentous achievement that took years to pass and just seconds for the president to veto this bill. And by vetoing, then he is in direct violation of the Constitution, just as Obama had been. Most recently, there have been cuts in aid to Yemen. So citing interference, US aid cut 86%, of their aid to Houthi-controlled northern Yemen. Now, it's important to know that Houthi-controlled North Yemen is where about 70% of the population lives. So they're essentially cutting most aid to most people in Yemen. And citing funding issues this past month, the World Food Program cut half of its aid to northern Yemen. And most recently, the UN also announced that they're closing various other programs due to funding issues. If you're wondering about coronavirus in Yemen, there's been one confirmed case so far, just almost 2 weeks ago. And the impact of coronavirus in Yemen, however, is going to be devastating. I wrote this article for In These Times magazine last month, where I interviewed Yemeni American epidemiologist, Dr. Aisha Jaman, and she kind of talks through the horror of the Yemeni healthcare system. She's been very intimately involved with aid in Yemen. And she said they do not have the capacity to test large numbers of people. They don't have chemicals for disinfectants. Face masks are highly expensive, if available at all. They cannot test or isolate people. They do not have equipment. They do not have ventilators. There's nothing that they have to even make them deal with this at 10% capacity. So this is a really horrifying statistic. And it's important to note that half of the hospitals in Yemen have been bombed, and the other half are barely functioning at 50% capacity. And so to think that they are ready to deal with the impact of coronavirus is highly unlikely. I think it would be the worst country in terms of the loss if this were to spread in Yemen. Citing coronavirus concerns, the Saudi-UAE coalition on April 9th announced a unilateral ceasefire announcement. And just days later, on April 15th, Yemenis reported, as you can see here from Twitter, that there were bombings in the capital of Sana'a and across different areas in the country. The Yemen Data Project, you can follow them at Yemen Data on Twitter, reported that week 1 of Yemen ceasefire, Yemen Data recorded at least 26 air raids with up to 106 individual airstrikes in the first week of the 2-week ceasefire, a 66% reduction in bombings from the previous week. No civilian casualties were recorded in air raids, and you can read much more about that. As you can see, the bombing has continued. Civilian casualties from those bombing have not been reported yet, but the blockade also continues, which, like I mentioned earlier, kills a lot more people than those bombings. So to summarize, the war and blockade have had an absolutely devastating impact on the people of Yemen. Without substantial US support, however, the Saudis and the UAE cannot continue to maintain the destruction of Yemen to such a large degree. Remember that they rely almost entirely on US support, from purchasing weapons to training and maintaining, training their soldiers, to choosing targets, to maintaining, upgrading their vehicles and aircrafts. And so without US support, it makes it very difficult for them to continue to wage this war. Congress still has authority to end this war. The War Powers Resolution can be invoked over and over again by any member of Congress. And we can pursue, we've tried this before, it wasn't successful, but pursuing and cut to funding, defunding the war essentially through the National Defense Authorization Act. Yes, civil conflict and war might continue in Yemen, is likely to continue. There's no way that it would be as devastating as what we've seen in Yemen over the last 5 years due to the international intervention. So those of you who are interested in solidarity with the Yemeni people, I invite you to and urge you to keep talking to your elected officials. The ask here is not to do anything. The ask is to stop doing what they're doing. So ending US support for the war in Yemen. If you want to learn more about US specific actions, I invite you to follow Yemeni Alliance Committee. This is its founder, Jihan Hakim, who's Yemeni American, and facebook.com/YAC of California, where you can learn about certain actions. Right now, they're calling on funding agencies to resume funding aid to Yemen. And if you're also interested, Dr. Aisha Jaman, that I mentioned earlier, she is the president of Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. You can find her website at yemenfoundation.org. So thank you for your time. You can also reach me at al-Adeimi@msu.edu or follow me on Twitter at Shireen818, where I dedicate my account for raising awareness about the conflict in Yemen. And I will stop sharing my screen, and I think we can begin question and answer.
Well, thank you very much, Shireen, for that wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it. And technical difficulties aside, we were able to manage that pretty quick. So wonderful, wonderful work. We do have a few questions that are coming in. Okay, this one is from my friend Carol Coakley. She says the cover photo of your presentation looked like a lively public square at night. And she says most of the pictures she's seen of Yemen show destruction and starvation. What does it look like in Yemen now? Is that an old picture that you used? How is daily life carrying on through this war?
Thank you for that question, Carol. I think it's really remarkable how people seem to resume life and hope despite all the circumstances. I'm not quite sure about the source of that picture, the timeline of it, but it's not uncommon for that scene to play out currently in, let's say, the capital, Sana'a or Aden. As you can also see from other points in time, rural areas tend to be much more devastated by conflict and war than major centers, right? And so yes, there's a lot of people who are displaced, internally displaced in Sana'a, but it's not as hard hit as some of the areas in rural Yemen, which is, many of the areas, many people live in rural areas where it's difficult to access healthcare and they don't have access to markets and things like that. And so people still, go out, people still live their lives. It's been 5 years. Those who are able to work. Those who are able to go to school, go to school. But it's still, 80% of the people are in need of humanitarian aid. But that doesn't mean that social life just kind of stops and ends for people who are able to resume their daily lives. So it's not all death and destruction, but of course, that's what the focus is now on because of the urgency of this matter.
Yeah, it's amazing what people can endure. Another question, this is from Jordan Shefferman. Shireen, can you talk about the United States and Saudi Arabia's capitalist interests in Yemen? Is there resources that are driving this? Anything like
that? So there's no oil. We've seen other wars for oil. There's no oil in Yemen. There are some talks about kind of potential gas fields, but Saudi may be interested in that. I think most importantly, the strategic location. Bab el-Mandeb Strait is an important location for both the Americans and the Saudis. It always has been. And so for a long time, the Saudis have tried to maintain control over Yemen because of that location. The other interest that Saudi has in Yemen is that they don't want a revolutionary country at the south of their border. And so back in the 60s, when northern Yemenis were fighting the monarchy, which was the Zaydi monarchy, by the way, the Saudis supported that monarchy against the revolutionaries because they want to maintain that same kind of system of government in that area. In 2011, when Bahrain revolted, the Saudis basically sent tanks and crush that revolution because again, they don't want people in those areas to revolt because if their own citizens start to see those examples so close to home, then they might do something too, is the fear. But capitalist interests, I think, have a lot to do with Yemen's strategic location.
Okay, this next question is from Mike Van Elzacker. Is there any evidence that a President Joe Biden would be better on the issue of Saudi Arabia and Yemen than President Trump?
Thank you, Mike, for that question. Here's the big debate, right? This war began under President Obama. There was no question that the Obama administration was just as connected to the Saudis as the Trump administration has. They have continued to play the role of partners, strategic partners. Obama violated the Constitution just like Trump violated the Constitution. Biden was his VP. Biden didn't speak out against the war in Yemen until just a few months ago in 2019. And so we had, I mean, I had my hopes on Senator Sanders, because he was the one who led the effort in the Senate to end the war in Yemen. Even before this was a popular issue, it's still not a popular issue by any means, but it gained more prominence with him. So I don't think that the guy who helped start the war will be enthusiastic about ending it. Simply said, I don't know what that means for people in Yemen, for people here who are voting. People can choose what they want to choose, of course, but I can't see that, you know, Biden's history speaks for itself. He voted for the war in Iraq. He turned around and supported the war in Yemen. And there doesn't seem to be any indication that he would try to end this disastrous relationship with the Saudis.
Thank you for that answer. This is a tough question, but it's a good one from Jung Dae Kim. What would be the ideal solution to this war? What are some of the things that you would like to see happening? What does an end to this war look like?
I want people to step back for a second and imagine, I know that we didn't live through this, but when America was having its own revolution against the British, imagine if France decided to intervene, you know, Canada decided to intervene with, you know, whatever. Like if countries intervene, then it's really hard for people to make their own, you know, determine their own outcome. And so what I would hope for is that for people to step back. This is not something that they need to be concerned with. The people of Yemen have every right to determine their own future. And so I don't want countries like the US, you know, and Canada and the UK, after benefiting so much from this war in Yemen financially, to turn around and say, okay, well, now we're going to join peace talks, or now we're going to play broker. They have no right to play that role of firefighter, essentially, after they've lit the place on fire, right? And so I think it's absolutely up to the Yemeni people to talk amongst themselves. Without foreign intervention, it's possible. I mentioned earlier how Saleh and the Houthis went from being enemies to working together. You know, there have been these shifting alliances in Yemen throughout our history, and in the end, people will do what's best for them and what's best for the country. But it's really hard to do that with so much foreign intervention going on. There's no way that the American Revolution could have happened if there was so much foreign intervention. This country just last year, you know, lost its mind at the idea that Russia may have been involved in influencing our elections. But we continue to do that in countries like Yemen much more overtly, and still think that people have the chance. They won't have a chance to determine their own future with so much interference. So I would like all of this to end so that Yemenis can, you know, chart their own path forward.
And I have another similar question. As you said, the Houthis changed their position and did ally with Salah for a time. What is the attitude of the Houthis toward a negotiated settlement ending this war?
So the ceasefire announcement that Saudis announced a couple weeks ago came after what I think it's been months of talks, direct talks with the Houthis. So they've shown willingness to talk to the Saudis. They don't see this as a war between themselves and Hadi. They've said many times that this is a war between them and the Saudis and the US. And so they've been eager for talks, direct talks with the Saudis. They've also mentioned that no ceasefire makes sense without also acknowledging that the blockade is still active and that Saudis need to lift their blockade. Look, they have a lot of support within Yemen, but there are also a lot of people who are against the Houthis. So in the end, whether people, I think, are pro or anti-Houthi is really not the issue. Most Yemenis, I would argue, want an end to the war, but they also don't want to live under occupation. My own family in the south is living under occupation. The southern part of Yemen is ruled by the Saudis. And in that area of the country, we have groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS who are running amok. Al-Qaeda famously notoriously worked alongside the Hadi government and, US allies essentially against the Houthis, and have gained much more power than they had before. There have also been these secret prisons that the UAE has, there's this investigation by the AP, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation, that uncovered at least 18 prison sites, secret prisons operated by the UAE. The UAE is also occupying islands in the south, using various resources and whether it's islands or gas liquefaction plants or ports, the city's ports, for example. So there's a lot of interest among these colonizers in the south, and there's no security, and people are still starving and dying, and coronavirus is currently in South Yemen. So it doesn't look good for people who are even living under this US-backed coalition. And people see that in the north and say, we don't want that for us either. So wherever people stand, I think they're united in that they don't want this war to continue.
I'll ask a question myself. It seems very clear to me and my colleagues just how bad the actions of the coalition have been in Yemen. You just mentioned Al-Qaeda. I've seen reports from the likes of CNN and the New York Times that weapons that have been given to Saudi Arabia and the UAE are on multiple occasions ending up in the hands of international terrorist groups like al-Qaeda. Also that child soldiers from the Horn of Africa are being employed to fight on the ground in Yemen. Why is it that such egregious violations are not being covered more in the media? Why haven't they broken through?
I ask myself that question a lot. I think I hoped better and wished better from the American mainstream media. But there, like you said, there's been inconsistent reporting. So you hear these isolated incidents almost about, oh, well, weapons have ended up with al-Qaeda, but no follow-up or connection to the fact that al-Qaeda was directly working with Hadi forces, that Hadi, the government that we're trying to reinstate, has people working for him and, in his own cabinet who are US designated terrorists. And so, there are all these incomplete stories that you hear from the media. Or, oh, a bomb just dropped and killed a bunch of families in Yemen. Okay, who made that bomb? Who helped, drop it? Who was in the command room? Well, the US. And so if people start to report accurately, then there's a lot of scrutiny and self-reflection that they're gonna have to do about when this war started. Well, it started under Obama's administration, with full support from the Obama administration. And there was very little coverage until it became Trump's war, essentially. And so it remains a bipartisan kind of issue. Even in Congress, nothing was moving along when this was Obama's war. It became easier for people to take this issue on, for Democrats to take this issue on when it became Trump's war. But of course, they weren't going to impeach Trump over Yemen, because that means that they should have impeached Obama over violating the constitution in Yemen. And so there are all these political games that people play, and the media oftentimes acts like it's a branch of the government, which makes no sense to me in a country that enjoys free press. But there have been multiple failures at every level, whether it's journalistic failures or, political failures that have continued to enable this war. Until now, you won't read an article. It's very difficult. I started writing these articles because it was very difficult for me as a Yemeni to read articles that were, fair and didn't just throw words around that had no, without backing, without evidence, like Iran allied, for example, or Iran backed Houthis, when there's no evidence for that. So it's been very frustrating for those of us who have been trying to end this war for a long time, to see how Yemenis are just used as a pawn, as a political pawn, or just ignored entirely.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said about an unwillingness to criticize the Obama administration, President Barack Obama himself. Even with the passage of the War Powers Act, we didn't see that criticism, or at least I didn't hear it. And I think that's part of the problem why more people have not rallied together to end this war, because it really is a bipartisan effort. one more question from Sindo Hussein. What is your view on the UN and UNICEF's involvement in Yemen and their efforts to help those impacted by the war? They're hearing mixed opinions, and they want to get your perspective.
I think the UN is in a difficult position because they get so much of their funding from coalition partners, right? From the US and the UK and Saudi Arabia. And so they have to, they have to kind of walk on eggshells when they're criticizing. They can't criticize anyone. 3 or 4 years ago, under the previous UN General Ban Ki-moon, when he placed Saudi under the list of this, nominal list of child killers, the shame list, within 72 hours, he had to pull them out of that list. And he made a public announcement saying that this was in fact because of Saudi pressure, because Saudi threatened to pull funding from UNICEF. And so they had to remove their name from this list of child killers, even though they were killing children in Yemen. And so I feel like the UN continues to play this role of, all siding the issue so as to come across as neutral. There is no all sides when there's an occupied and an occupier. When one country is being devastated and hundreds of thousands of civilians have died in Yemen, and you can't even find one single Saudi civilian casualty who's died. So this isn't a balanced war. The Yemenis don't own a single plane, let alone warships and jets and whatnot that the Saudi and their coalition does. And so this isn't a two-sided war. This isn't a balanced kind of war, right? It's, Genocide Watch calls this a level 9 extermination because Yemenis are basically in Yemen and, they're being starved and killed every single day. And there's very little that they can do to even retaliate. But the UN plays this role of trying to make it sound like all parties are equally to blame. And I think they're doing that because they get so much of their funding from Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the US. And right now they're citing funding cuts. And so that's why they're saying that they're going to shut down their programs in Yemen. But who are these countries providing the aid? Well, it's the same countries that have caused the destruction in the first place.
We have so many good questions coming in, and our time is running short. So I think I'm going to take two and make them into one question. As you just said, you started writing articles because you found it was difficult to find accurate and fair ones out there. Paul asks, what are the latest trends regarding the danger of famine or cholera? We found it very difficult to find updated numbers that are accurate. And I'll combine this with another question from Donna Bosco. What can we do to get the media to do a better job on this? Because we do feel that that's part of the problem, just not getting the information out.
Thank you for those questions. So Yemen is currently fighting 4 outbreaks. The cholera outbreak, which is by far the largest in modern history. At the height of the outbreak in cholera in Haiti, it was about 730,000 people who were infected. Yemen already has more than 2 million cases of cholera outbreaks, infections. They're also fighting an H1N1 or swine flu outbreak, as well as diphtheria and dengue fever. So they're barely able to keep up with these 4 outbreaks. And so with the coronavirus outbreak, like forget it, the system is just gonna collapse entirely. I don't even know how it survived, to be honest with you. And, the famine, people continue to starve because the Saudis control how much aid gets into the country. They're only getting about 20% of what they need. And so people are starving to death. If you don't have access to food or medicine, you die. Children die because of, completely preventable illnesses, like a cold could kill a child without medication, or a fever, for example, could kill a child without medication. And so we don't quite know the full statistics. Like I said, I think when the war is over, hopefully someday soon, and people go back and tally up kind of the dead, it's going to be absolutely horrific to know how many people have been killed and died silently, and their deaths have not been recorded in any significant way. As for what we can do, I think absolutely keep pushing the media on this. Like if you can write to your local newspaper to keep this issue alive. Again, the issue is not help save Yemen. The issue is stop bombing Yemen and stop starving Yemen. Let them resume, trade without the blockade. Let people live and be in control of their own destiny. I think that would be the thing to do, and with politicians to continue reminding their elected officials that this issue is on them. This is what they helped create, and they're going to have to end it legislatively. And we really should stop voting for people who have caused so much death and destruction, and who continue to tell us that they will continue supporting the Saudis. So I would say that, that's what solidarity would look like for the people with the people of Yemen.
Well, thank you so much for answering so many questions. I certainly feel more educated on the issue, and I'm sure our attendees do as well. Would you like to let us know, where people can find you? I'm sure they can just type your name into Google, but you're what are you on? You're on Twitter. Where people can find your articles so they can learn more.
Sure, thank you. My articles can be found at In These Times magazine. If you Google my name, you'll find it right away. And also, like I mentioned earlier, my Twitter is kind of dedicated to this cause. And so at Shireen, Shireen 818 is the easiest way to get in touch with me. And thank you for those of you who've shown up today and to learn more about this issue and to keep this cause alive in your communities. I know that people are going through a lot right now, and I hope that in moments like these, where we all feel like we're in this together, we could spare that empathy to people around the world who are also struggling, not because of some natural disaster, but because of our own government's actions.
Thank you, Shireen. I've just shared my screen. We have just launched a change.org petition. This is a webinar of the Raytheon anti-war campaign, and why we're talking about Yemen is because of their direct role in the suffering of the people of Yemen. It's their bombs, among others, like Lockheed Martin that Shireen mentioned, that are being found in the aftermath of these airstrikes. So a new effort in the time of coronavirus that we're launching is a petition to request that Raytheon take some of its resources and make a change. Instead of making bombs and missiles that they sell to Saudi Arabia, they should be putting those resources into making ventilators to save lives immediately. Raytheon loves to say that they exist to make the world a safer place, but this pandemic has shown us that the threat that really exists to our national security is not from some foreign foe. It's certainly not from the people of Yemen. It is right now from the coronavirus that is killing friends and family members and neighbors. So we think that this is a good way to sort of bring some attention to what Raytheon is doing and to ask them to do the right thing. They may not do it, but if we can get some public support towards that end, maybe they'll be forced to make a statement. We can build up our numbers as well. So this change.org petition that you see on my screen and that I've shared in the chat, we've just launched it. We'll be sending a link in the follow-up email. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is just the first in a series. We're going to keep doing these until the war in Yemen ends. We're not going to stop fighting, just like Shireen. We all want to be like Shireen. But on April 30th at 9:30 a.m., we're going to be having a webinar with some representatives from Human Rights Watch. In the first week of May, we will be having a webinar with Major Danny Sherzin. He's done a lot of research recently on the connections between Raytheon, big military industrialist CEOs, and government policy. They're very intertwined. So please take some time, sign the change.org petition, and get involved. Get involved, because we need all the help that we can get, and the clock is ticking for people in Yemen. They really need our help so that we stop our involvement, because what's being done in the United States and right here in Massachusetts is really facilitating this war and making it go on and on and on. So just a reminder, this is a webinar of the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign. We want to thank our members, Mass Peace Action, That's for Peace, United Against War and Militarism, Campaign for Peace, Disarmament and Common Security, WILF, AFSC, Friends Meeting at Cambridge, and I neglected to mention our student groups, who have been a great help for us to get this word out on campus when Raytheon comes to town recruiting. That is BU Students Against Imperialism, Brandeis Dissenters, MIT Students Against War, Northeastern Students for Justice in Palestine. So efforts on all fronts to counter Raytheon and their war profiteering. We want to thank everyone for participating today, and look to your inbox for a follow-up email. It will have actions that you can take and ways that you can join up with the campaign. We need you, and we hope that you stand with us in solidarity with the people of Yemen. And on that note, I'd like to thank you all and wish you well. Have a wonderful weekend, and we hope all your family and friends are staying safe and staying healthy. Thank you so much for joining us today.